Okay, this one needs to be made. This is about AI, ChatGPT, and psychosis, and people who are vulnerable to psychosis. Now, just for a bit of background, this is based on an experience I've had tonight, and that's why I'm making the video right now. Because it's current, it's important, um, and it's something that I'm currently working with a few people on. We're writing something about this at the moment. I won't go into too much detail because we're still developing the argument. But um, large language models are very, very helpful for certain things, right? So let's look at what I've used ChatGPT for over the last 10 days or so. I've done, I've asked it to process the podcast transcripts and turn them into short books. Huge time saver. Yeah, I could sit down and do it manually, but that's a fairly safe task for an LLM. Say, here's my thesis, here's my published research, get a sense of my tone and my structure and my voice, process all of the transcripts from that playlist, and just knock me up a book that contains pretty much everything I say in book form. So I can publish these for anybody who listens to the playlist and wants a tangible, portable version of those ideas. And I ran some checks and some safeguards, and I said, did you hallucinate anything? Is there anything missing? What have you actually done here? Place a disclaimer at the front of the book saying this was written with AI so people know that they're engaging with AI generated material. For that use case, I'm happy. Androids Do Dream is now on Amazon. Yeah. Did the same with the PhD playlist. I'm happy with that too. Yeah. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be accurate. It just has to distill the ideas that are in those playlists into book form. That's just transposition. That's fine from my point of view. Ethically, practically, I don't have a problem with that. What I've also been using it for is another book called How Language Holds. Now, this is kind of a level up from what I was doing before. This time I said, can you take the transcripts from my corpus and find common themes that my research participants were tapping into? And it put together a book about how language functions under pressure. What struck me about that book was it was bringing to the fore things that my thesis couldn't address, because the trajectory of my thesis was very much about looking at thought disorder from a symptom viewpoint, gathering natural language, doing an analysis to see where language was breaking down in comparison to a non-psychiatric speaker group. And that I'm very proud of that work. And AI wasn't involved at all. That was great. And what this was very much can you collapse some themes and talk about what was common to what the participants were saying, right? So instead of looking at where their language was breaking down, it was more looking at what, if any, what similarities, if any, were there in those 15 interviews. And one of the reasons I decided to publish that work as a book was, one, because it was a mass market book, it wasn't going to go into a journal, and two, because a lot of the themes that the LLM identified, I had experienced in the process of interviewing. I'd actually noticed these things. I'd noticed that participants were denying that they did creative things with language and then proceeding to do creative things with language in their speech. So I'm very happy with that book. And there's a disclaimer at the front that says this is a large language model's impression of the content of the interviews. Again, guardrails. I'm happy with that in a bounded way. My readers know what they're getting, right? So that's fine, but I wouldn't publish it in a journal as research. And then the last thing I did was I said to ChatGPT, can you analyze my speech in the interviews? And can you tell me where language broke down because of things I did? So if you look at my research, what I've done with that data set, I've done an analysis, a very rigorous manual PhD level analysis of where language is breaking down structurally in the participants' output. Then I've said, now let's look at content using LLM and common themes. And now I've said, now let's look at my role in where language broke down. Where communication broke down, actually, is probably a better way of saying it. And that was interesting. And that's now up on ResearchGate as a piece of grey literature, just a teaching resource, a 2-page teaching resource for anyone who's interested, mainly to fill a methodological gap in guidance for qualitative interviewers working with people with schizophrenia on abstract topics, which is a bit of a flashpoint. Like, people with schizophrenia struggle with open topics, particularly abstract ideas, right? So I was essentially saying, let's look at where my interviewing strategies were successful in terms of keeping the conversation going, and where the things that I was doing were actually causing a problem. So over the last couple of weeks, I've had lots of success and fun with ChatGPT, and this directly follows a criticism of ChatGPT for PhD students. I maintain that criticism. PhD students shouldn't be relying on large language models at all. What I'm doing is playing with AI in safe, bounded contexts where the stakes are very low, right? And I'm doing as much checking and ethical work as I can to make sure that what I'm doing is transparent and everybody knows the limits of what I'm doing with AI. I've also been doing some other stuff with AI relating to the YouTube channel. And this is the most important part of the video, right? In relation to people with psychosis interacting with large language models. What happened tonight was, over the last couple of days, I've been feeding ChatGPT my YouTube analytics, and I've been saying, what's going on in these numbers? I could do it myself. I could look at the numbers myself and piece together what's going on. But it's nice to just give ChatGPT some numbers and say, can you give me a summary of the descriptive statistics? It's much quicker. And it says, and what's beneficial about that is that it has knowledge of YouTube's algorithm. So it can say, well, your click-through rate here is actually consistent with YouTube doing this. That's quite helpful. That's been quite instructive for making sure that the channel is behaving the way that I want it to behave. I want it to behave like an archive of resources rather than a sensationalist clickbait channel. I'm not chasing the algorithm, right? I'm interested in professionals and people with lived experience engaging meaningfully with the material. And so a lot of the stuff that I'm doing with large language models at the moment with the analytics is making sure that the channel is on course for that kind of reception and usage. And thankfully it is. ChatGPT also generates all the thumbnails for the channel. ChatGPT generates my stream overlays. So I've been using AI quite a lot in the rebrand and everything. But something very important happened tonight that really underscores the risk for people with experience of psychosis, people who are vulnerable to thought processes that are related to psychosis. And that is ChatGPT, when I asked it about my schizophrenia bulletin first-person accounts, started feeding me information that suggested that one of my schizophrenia bulletin accounts was paywalled because it was difficult material for clinicians. Now, what happened as a result of that is I then recorded a video, which I've now re-recorded, and the corrected version is available on my channel. But for maybe an hour or so earlier this evening, 8 people saw a video where I said quite confidently, this particular first-person account is paywalled because it might not be deemed suitable for the public. That's not how academic publishing works, right? That's not how the paywall process works. Paywalls aren't used to restrict access to papers because they're controversial, right? But in the course of working with LLMs over the last week, I just absorbed what ChatGPT told me about my own paper. And then in the course of making a video, I just made an offhand remark as though that was the case. So this is the danger, right? When I then went back to ChatGPT, I said, this is what you just told me. Can you clarify what happened there? And it basically said, yes, what I did was I collapsed two separate ideas and presented them as one idea, which LLMs are very good at doing. If they don't have information about what's in the gap, they will collapse the gap and create a sort of hybrid of the two endpoints and fill the middle with that, right? So this is where you got to be really careful with placing your trust in what an LLM tells you. For certain tasks, like, can you summarize my analytics? That's fine. Can you turn a podcast into a book? That's generally fine, right? If it's got enough guardrails, work only off the transcripts. Can you check that nothing's been hallucinated? All of that stuff. But when you start absorbing what it tells you as though that's the truth, that's very risky. And in the case of me and my personal psychiatric history, it's not good for me to be told that my contributions to an academic journal on the topic of psychosis is being intentionally suppressed in a very plausible way, in a way that sort of says, like, the LLM didn't turn around and say there's a conspiracy against you. The LLM provided a very reasoned and comprehensive argument as to why Schizophrenia Bulletin would paywall that particular article, because it touches on structural issues in psychiatry, and therefore a decision may have been made that it was more appropriate to keep it within house for clinician readers only. But that's not how paywall works. That's not how the ethics of open access versus paywalled articles work. And my critical faculties just shut off. And I just made a video conveying that piece of information as though that was the case, when it's not the case. So this is an illustration of the dangers of prolonged AI use and reliance, right? I am now, at this point, radically rethinking my involvement with AI, right? It's been incredibly useful for rebranding the channel. It's been incredibly useful for preserving the tone of the channel and flagging parts of videos that may need clarification. When you say this, you probably want to add a disclaimer just saying, look, by the way, this isn't general guidance about medication. That's all been incredibly helpful. But the caution that I want to exercise here is that it's very much about what you give it. It's very much about the guardrails, and it's also very much about how you shield yourself from just blindly accepting the information it gives you, right? And in many ways, I'm quite embarrassed that I fell for that trap. But in other ways, I'm not particularly surprised, because I've had 10 days of ChatGPT performing exceptionally well and doing what I asked it to do at high levels of accuracy. So I was kind of lulled into a false sense of security in some ways as well. But that is a illustrative example of how over-reliance on AIs can lead you down a very dangerous path. Because if I'd have left that video up, I'd have greatly misled a lot of people about how that particular journal operates. And that journal has been fantastic to me. They have published contributions that are not easy to place, I am touching on debates in psychiatry that tend to occur more privately than they do publicly. And they've given space for me to make those arguments, right? So, yeah, cautions and warnings with ChatGPT, yeah?